a more proper balance about the promise of politics, what we can do. We should be profoundly optimistic that we can tackle serious problems once again. But instead, in my view, we are still imprisoned by a Reconstruction post-Civil War blindness that shapes the whole landscape such that we're not even aware of it. We're not aware that we are imprisoned in language that was largely invented by the same George Wallace who failed to protect segregation forever, but in his failure was a genius enough of a politician to invent phrases of resentment and fear against the tides that were liberating America by denouncing pointy-headed bureaucrats in Washington who were trying to tell people how to run their businesses and where they should go to school, and that they were in cahoots with a biased media that had a racial agenda to concentrate all effective power on the central government in Washington with its tax and spend liberals. Every one of those phrases is vintage George Wallace, and every one of them is chillingly contemporary. It is an attitude far more than a judgment that imprisons our politics, shuts us off not only from accurate history, but shuts us off from the promise of democracy. So I'm hoping that this issue of the monthly, focusing on race, and you are focusing on this issue, people's resistance to it, people's resistance to discuss race, to insist simultaneously that race is solved and that it is unsolvable, propositions that have in common only that they both mean we don't need to discuss it. This issue discusses it. The civil rights movement and our history shows us that when we do discuss it, when we get beyond our comfort zones, when we learn things, that's when good things happen. That's when that's the doorway to the promise of freedom. So until we're as comfortable discussing race as we are sports, America is still not there yet, and I hope that we can take advantage of this amazingly resonant time. We're marching through these 50-year anniversaries, and advantage of the articles here to really bring our history back into balance, bring our country back into balance, and address the problems of the future with intelligence and with patriotism. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I am so happy that Amtrak, or the MARC, got its act together. It was certainly wonderful to hear the comments that have been made so far. Let me bring you greetings on behalf of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. As you know, I'm Gail Christopher, Vice President for Program Strategy there, and it is the Board of Directors of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation that has had the audacity and the courage to say that America must deal with the legacy, not of race, but of racism. And that is a very important distinction. Racism is the belief system that undergirds this history that we speak of. It is a belief that dates back to the 1700s, that somehow there is a human hierarchy of value. It emerged at a time when all manner of knowledge was being organized and categorized, from animals to trees to birds to plants. And so why not human beings? And the great philosophers and scientists and anthropologists of the time suggested that the pinnacle of that hierarchy was reflected in their own image of whiteness. And that hierarchy descended through people of yellow pigmentation and red pigmentation, and ultimately to the depths of what was called black. And that put in place the justification for the types of inhumane and brutal and atrocious human behaviors and systems that indeed formed our nation. And so the work of uprooting that belief system, that's the work that we have yet to do. At the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we decided that our mission, which is to ensure that all children thrive, particularly the most vulnerable children, that our mission in a time of great demographic shift, when in fact the majority of the children that are born in this nation are children of color, that our mission to assure that they thrive could not be addressed without dealing with the discomfort and the denial of the legacy and the presence of a belief system, an absurdity that somehow we are not one human family, that somehow our physical characteristics, which are but a manifestation of the brilliance of nature, to enable us to adapt to the environments in which we evolved, that somehow these physical characteristics determine our innate worth and value as human beings. And that's the essence of racism. But that system was inculcated into every intellectual, commercial, judicial, religious, philosophical, medical system that we have. So the imbalances that you see in this country today, they like to call them disparities, I call them inequities, are but reflections of that deep-seated belief. Is it conscious? In most of us? No. In some of us, yes. I understand that the Ku Klux Klan petitioned, and I don't know if they actually executed it, but they were going to have a rally on the Mall on the anniversary of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So yes, some people really, really consciously adhere to that belief. But most of us have been swept up in it, and we don't even know it. Because it's very easy to be at the top of that professed hierarchy and never even have to think about it. It's impossible to be at the bottom or the other gradations of that hierarchy and not think about it on a daily basis and not internalize the absurdity of the devaluation of your humanity on a daily basis. My lovely daughter once said to me, "Mom, how did the story of African Americans get inverted into a story of victimization only? How is that story not a story of phenomenal triumph and victory? How is our story not captured and told, embodying the courage and the perseverance and the amazing qualities that are possessed by our people?" And I said to her, "You know, because we don't tell the story." And so there is a very important thing that's happened here with this Washington Monthly. And that is, stories are being told that are never, ever told. That 100 years between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights era is like one big blur. It's like those 100 years didn't happen. And what happened to people during those 100 years is seldom, if ever, considered. I have jettisoned the word slave from my vocabulary and replaced it with enslaved human beings. Because when you say slave, you conjure up something, some sort of entity that was created and perpetuated. And you strip away the humanity, the human beings who were entrapped in that experience. I also don't use the word race very often. I have to say racism, because it's an ism, it's a belief system, and that's what we have to get rid of, because the concept of race, biologically, is a total fallacy. And thank goodness for the insights of the human genome that have reminded us that we are all 99.9% the same. So those ideas that there were some sort of mental differences, and if you get into the medical apartheid and you get into the medical experimentations to justify the differences, it's unconscionable. You can't even read it. But the fact is, it was all a lie. It was all stupidity, and we've evolved beyond it. And we all know that we are basically constituted as the same. So what do we do now with 4 centuries of fallacy? We believe at the Kellogg Foundation that we have to heal. And so our foundation, our board, put significant dollars, although now, after 5 years, I realize that it's a drop in the ocean. But they put about $100 million behind funding community-based groups who had the courage to deal with this issue. But we understood very early on that a primary audience or focus for this work had to be the media, because the media has embraced the Wallace language, has embraced consciously and unconsciously much of the confusion, and so because they shape our consciousness, they project a lot of that confusion, and we buy it on a daily basis. And so we were very honored to be able to be a partner with the Washington Monthly in putting this issue together. And we hope it's the first of many efforts on the part of the media in general to have the courage to tell the stories that make us who we are as a country. We struggled. Some of it is hard to even think about, let alone read about, but it is who we are. And one of the phrases we constantly get is this just about black and white? And that word just makes me crazy. But it isn't, quote, just about black and white. It's a systematic exclusion and a systematic hierarchy, if you will, which puts white at the top and everybody else beneath. We as a country cannot afford that any longer, period. We simply cannot thrive as a democracy without opening opportunity to everyone and somehow just getting rid of the fallacy of the belief in racial hierarchy as it manifests both consciously and unconsciously. Quickly, let me tell you some of the critical lessons we've learned in the last 5 years of funding this effort across the country and also in Brazil. We have learned that the unconscious bias concept is the one that we have to put legs on. We have to really figure out if a doctor, and the evidence is clear, there are hundreds of studies, if a doctor will make different prescriptions for the same condition unconsciously based on perceived racial difference, how do you change that doctor's behavior? Because they are not willingly being biased, but they have been programmed to believe certain stereotypical perceptions, and it influences their decisions. So the unconscious bias area, and it applies in criminal justice, it applies in education, it applies in schools. So we've learned that we've got to fund and get more work going, not to identify the problem, but to identify the solutions to it. We know that just becoming aware of unconscious bias is a step toward debiasing. It's a step toward